Today's video is going to be dealing with chapter 4 in our textbook, and it's on Buddhism. And so this is a rather long chapter, and it's got quite a bit of information, but I wanted to at least cover some of it today in the video. So I hope this finds you doing well, and I hope this helps you. So as we start into our first slide, we'll get to the Four Noble Truths in just a second. But the author starts out, he is again traveling, and he has arrived in a location, and he sees a stupa, but that is a golden spire of steps. It's necessary to go up these steps in order to get to the temple, and that's really part of the opening story that we have. And this is a Buddhist temple, and it teaches how to meditate, and that's going to be one of their important teachings that they have in order to become more spiritual. But the tour guide there is explaining how flowers at the base of the stupa bring good luck, and that'll be near the end of the chapter with some of the material things that are emphasized in Buddhism. And then the author does notice that Buddhism seems to have incorporated some other religious practices from earlier times. So other religions have impacted Buddhism is really what he is trying to get across to us. But for a few minutes, I wanted to give you a description of the life of the Buddha. As we mentioned here, it did start in India. It's a very old religion. And what's strange now is in India, a predominant religion is Hinduism instead of Buddhism. So Buddhism was born in India, but yet it is really being replaced with Hinduism. And some would say that really the reason Hinduism is more popular is because of the polytheism and the choice of gods that are available in that religion compared to Buddhism. So if we go back again thousands of years in the 5th century BC, India was just kind of in a state of ferment, and just a lot of and definitely religiously a lot of ferment state going on. So just a lot of anxiety, confusion going on at this time. People started trying to experiment with different things that they thought would help them in their religious life. And so meditation, deep breathing, studying with gurus, all of these were some of the things that happened as a result of the times. Now, we had talked also about the Vedic religion. And so there were a lot of people who were really opposed to that, and they were looking for something new. Now, the Buddha, his real name is Siddhartha Gautama, and Buddha just means the enlightened one. So later on in his life, after he accomplishes what he wanted to, religiously speaking, he became known as the Buddha, and that's how a lot of people refer to him today. But just a little bit of history about Siddhartha Gautama is that he was born in a tribe, the Shakya tribe. Again, a lot of these names are hard to pronounce. But this would be somewhere near Nepal in the lower Himalaya mountains today. His mother's name was Maya, and she had a dream, and part of the dream indicated that a white elephant entered her side. And this is thought to be the moment of conception when she was carrying the future Buddha who would influence just many, many people. So in other words, he had a miraculous conception that was, from his mother and near her heart. Now, after he was born, his mother died about a week later. So his aunt is the one who was charged with raising him. And then they discovered special marks upon his body. And this has historically been known as something that would foretell great things in one's future. So I know even, a bunch of centuries later, something very similar happened to Sigmund Freud in psychology, but he was born with a lot of hair, and there was somebody in the room that thought, well, hey, this is going to foretell great things that this boy would do as he grew up. But the same kind of prophecy held true for the Buddha. Now, priests who were there told his father, the Buddha's father, that, hey, your son's life could take one of two directions. And one is that he would be follow in his father's footsteps and become a great king and world ruler. So, more physical things, material things. And the second option is that if he were exposed to suffering and seeing suffering, then his life would take a path to where he would become a great spiritual leader and a world teacher. So the Buddha's father decided, well, hey, I want my son to become a great king. And so he made sure that his son basically grew up in luxury and did not experience any type of pain or suffering. So they were quite wealthy, and he basically had a very privileged childhood. Now, he married when he was younger, a young man, the Buddha, that is, and they had a son. In his life, the Buddha was educated. He was an educated man, and he was trained as a warrior. And his father basically gave him a command that he could go anywhere kind of on the royal compound, but not to go beyond the bounds of the royal grounds. And Buddha, he disobeyed his father's orders. Now, he came across these things when he went outside the royal grounds. He saw an old man who was crooked and toothless. He saw a sick man who was wasted by disease. He saw a corpse that was being taken for cremation. And then finally, he saw a wandering holy man, or a sannyasin. So these were the four passing sights, and it was made a very big impact upon the Buddha. So the wandering man, had basically given up on worldly possessions, but he seemed to be at peace. Now, this happened sometime when the Buddha was in his late 20s, somewhere around 29. And then this really shook him up. So he decided up to then his life had been really a pleasant prison. So he started to question a lot of things. He questioned the meaning of life, and why did some people suffer and why some people didn't. This caused him really to fall into a depression, and he no longer found joy in his luxurious and carefree life. So he decided one night while his family was sleeping, this would be the last time he would see him, and he left the compound, and he rode on a horse to the edge of the property with a servant, and he took off his royal clothing. He cut his hair very short. He put on simple clothing, gave the horse back to the servant, and then left home and never returned. So this is known as the Great Going Forth. So he sought out to learn techniques of meditation and philosophy, and he sought out teachers who would help him in this way. And again, the nagging questions that he had been thinking about for some time, and really I think about 6 years, was some of the questions people may still have today. But why is there suffering? Why do people get old and die? Why is there sickness? Is God behind all these things? Can suffering be avoided? How should we live? These were all on his mind, and he wanted answers. So he decided to live a life of austerity, and that's just very plain, very simple. You really don't use much of anything, no possessions, very little food and drink, very little clothing, no home, just the bare essentials. And he took this to such an extent that he almost died. So he was near death. And he was, later in his travels, he was, again, near death. And a woman encountered him in this condition while he was under a tree and kind of wasting away from this new lifestyle. And she offered him food, and he took it, and he was strengthened. And he found that even after all this, he was no closer to the answers to the questions that he was looking for. So from this point on, he would reject the ascetic, or this life of austerity where you just really don't have much of anything at all. He thought what would be a more reasonable course of action was a path of moderation. Now, sometimes you will see a reference to the Bodhi tree. And there again, he went to there and he would meditate. And he would do this. He wasn't going to leave until he had gotten the answers to his questions. And this is where he really adopted the title of the Buddha, or the Awakened One. So he is now enlightened. He has these answers that he's been searching for. He had been, these questions I had mentioned, he's been thinking about for a long, long time. And he finally has reached a state of understanding. And that's the awakening, or the enlightenment, under this Bodhi tree. And so he is called the Buddha. Now, the Buddha comes from the Sanskrit word meaning to wake up. So it's just seeing life in a different way. So there are lots of stories about him as a person. Some of them seem rather remarkable. But one was in a case, there was a downpour of rain, and a cobra raised up to protect the Buddha from the rain. That's one of those stories that I mentioned. But at this point, he started to attract some followers, and then he would continue to travel from village to village in India, and he would try to teach his insights to others about his way of life in order to help them. So he began an order, where people would follow him, and that was called the Sangha. And it's really a place where monks and nuns who are devoted to this type of living would live and also receive teaching and instruction. The Buddha is known for having a good relationship with his disciples. That's been recorded. And then how he lived, he basically ate moderately. Again, a middle path. No alcohol. He walked daily. He believed in meditation and clean air. So meditation would be hours and hours at a time in a seated position that you may think of. Again, we talked a little bit about yoga in chapter 3, but something similar to that. Now, he lived about age 80, and how he died was that he had eaten some food from a friend who wasn't trying to poison him or hurt him, but he became sick from the food, and it became apparent that he was going to die. So, as he was dying, now I'll mention it now, but there are some pictures later we'll talk about the reclining Buddha. But as he was getting sick, he was giving final advice to his disciples. And basically what he told them is to trust in yourself. Trust your own insights. Use your own self-control. This is the path to perfection and inner peace. And then he turned on his right side, and then he actually died. So that's the significance of the reclining Buddha. So here I've just got a temple in Thailand that has an example of that. And it's going back to his final moments here on earth. And the Buddha, even in death, was the model of how everybody should approach their end. So, again, gives you a little detail on the Buddha's life. So, it is kind of impossible to know what he taught because none of this was written down. But after his death, there were many people who did try to write the teachings down. And so that's maybe one thing to keep in mind, too. Now, I want to go to what our book has, or the chart has, on the Four Noble Truths, and these are certainly important events in the Buddha's life. Kind of mentioned them already, but the Four Noble Truths are a little bit different from those four sights, the four passing sights that we mentioned earlier. The first, to live is to suffer. That's the first noble truth. And so basically it is looking at that there is pain in life, there's decay, there's disease, and then eventually death. But to live means to experience loss, anxiety, and anguish. But living is filled with sorrow. That's one of the first truths, and again, based off those things that the Buddha saw when he left the royal grounds. The second noble truth is suffering comes from desire. So that is the idea, is that people suffer because they want what they cannot have. And then when they do have things, they are never satisfied. So that maybe explains why you live on the very basics that you can. Trishna is a word that means desire, thirst, or craving. So what it's saying is suffering comes from this constant desire, thirst, or craving that people have. Now, some desires we have are needed for survival, such as food, sleep, and air, and things like that. But others, such as clothing, housing, and health, just cause more suffering. But even Buddha, would say, well, hey, you need food, but it shouldn't be to the point that, life revolves around it and causes this suffering. A third noble truth is to end suffering, one must end desire. So that is completely at odds with Western culture, the way we live today. Our culture emphasizes individual rights, legal rights, moral rights, competition between individuals, individual success in education, careers, and sports. Now, Buddha, what he's trying to say here is any kind of attachment to anything is really related to suffering. So some people who are Buddhist, in order to show that they are trying to end their desire, they will shave their heads or wear special clothing that symbolize their detachment from worldly concerns. Now, that was the fourth passing sight that Buddha saw, was the wandering holy man who looked like he had nothing, but yet seemed to be happy in peace. And that's what Buddha was lacking when he saw that and was trying so hard to achieve. In this third noble truth, the goal is that life must be accepted and appreciated whenever possible. You may not be able to change the world, but you can change yourself and the way you experience the world. And the fourth and final noble truth is release from suffering is possible. So the ultimate goal in Buddhism is nirvana. Nirvana is that end of suffering, and then the inner peace and liberation that comes that when you get rid of all these things in the world. Nirvana also means blown out or cool, which maybe can be taken to mean that the fires of desire of life have been extinguished. So those are a little bit of the teachings there that the Buddha would have. Now following that is the Noble Eightfold Path. And the point of the Noble Eightfold Path is really the way to inner peace, is how can you have peace in your life. So there are other goals too, but that's overall the major one. But you try to face life objectively. You want to be kind to all. And this is the way that it is going to bring you inner peace. Now, these are not sequentially practiced, but all together. Now, they're listed like, hey, do right understanding first, and then you move to right intention. Well, that's the sequential notion. That's really not the way to do it, but you're trying to do all of these at the same time. So these are pretty clear, I think, most of them, but the first one is right understanding. That it's really understanding that life is not permanent. It's transitory, it's changing, and because of this changing, it's going to cause some of this suffering that we've been talking about for a few moments. The right intention is in reference to your thoughts and your motives, but they should be pure and whole and not tainted by selfish desires or emotions. So again, these are really kind of hard to understand, I think, or definitely to incorporate for people of Western cultures where a lot of our life is about individual wants and needs and things related to that. Right speech is our third of the Noble Eightfold Path. And so your speech itself should be kind. It should be honest. It should always be in a positive way. You would never lie. You would never exaggerate or use harsh words. So, think about our freedom of speech in the United States, our First Amendment right. Sounds like that would be, curtailing it quite a bit, but you're doing it because you think that's the right thing to do. The last one on this slide is right actions, and the idea is something we saw in Chapter 3 a little bit too, but your actions don't hurt anybody else. So that's anybody, anything that can feel hurt. So that's people, that's animals. And for example, you would not engage in any sexual conduct that would hurt others. You would not steal or do anything else that brings harm to others. Now, as we move on to the other slide, it has the remaining half of the Noble Eightfold Paths. And first one we see is right work. So the Buddhist in trying to perform this part of the path would not have a job that causes harm to others or oneself, the person, him or herself. Right effort is really looking at a consistent strive to improve. Now, I think of all the 8, that's one that we definitely would incorporate in Western societies today. Right meditation means being in the right mind, but that emphasizes the technique of meditation. There are so many different types mentioned in our chapter, but this is something that is done for a long period of time at once. And then finally, to finish up the Noble Eightfold Path is right contemplation. But this is really aimed at getting that blissful inner peace that we talked about. Maybe in essence, kind of like the nirvana, but trying to get to where you're on that path. So those are some of the big teachings there, the 4 Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. Now, part of our chapter does talk about this different branches of Buddhism. So think of that, of any religion that you can think of, there are people who disagree, and what happens is a new form of that religion starts. So whether it's Judaism, whether it's Christianity, whether it's Islam, or some other religion, you'll find where adherents, they disagree, and then they'll go off and start their own branch. So now our book has quite a bit of material, and I'm not going to mention all of it, but just a little bit around here. But, after Buddha died, there were disagreements over what he thought. And so really there's three big branches that our book mentions: Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. And again, I apologize for the pronunciation there. I think I'm close, but maybe off a little bit. But at any rate, the point is there's three branches of Buddhism. And they're going to disagree over what's important and what's not. Now, the PowerPoint does have an accurate translation of what Theravada means, and it is the way of the elders. So these are people who are going to say that they go back to exactly what Buddha taught. Now, all these groups are really going to say that. But they are basically very conservative, so that just means they're going to stick with what they thought Buddha taught. Buddha was very opposed to the Vedic rituals. He wanted things to be simple. He believed in meditation and detachment from the world. Now, we also can see where this branch is most popular on the slide. But this is really a group of monks who practice this form of Buddhism. So that's the monastic life, because they're basically a community of monks, and they are trying to live by the Buddha's teachings to reach nirvana. Now, really, the Theravada branch has its origins in the wandering holy man that we had seen early on in our chapter today. So these followers of Buddhism are very close to the people. They, for example, are going to be reliant upon donations for all kinds of things of their survival, whether it's food, clothing, or what have you. And they're going to be central in the community in trying to do good things, to practice their life, live their life, and spread their teaching. So that gives you a little bit of idea there. Now, our book goes on to describe a little bit more in detail about some of their teachings and literature, and that gets kind of lengthy, but again, these branches of Buddhism have their impact in society in terms of the architecture and art, the paintings, the sculptures, the clothing, and all kinds of symbols that they use. Now, the second school is the Mahayana, and that is really, again, our PowerPoint is correct, the big vehicle. And the reason it's called that is this branch of Buddhism is conceived as a ferry boat in which all types of people can be carried across a river. And they're carried across the river to reach their destination. The destination is enlightenment, this nirvana that is the release from suffering. Now, this form of Buddhism really focuses on everybody. So the first one was more about the monks. But the second one here is everybody can become enlightened, or in effect, anybody can become a Buddha. So the people who practice this would claim that it is so effective that it's met just about every religious and philosophical need that other earlier forms of Buddhism did not fulfill. Now this form of Buddhism is also active in the world. It also has a shift in what they consider virtuous. The previous ideal was, hey, you live in a monastery, you're detached from family life, from public life, but that's not what this branch, the big vehicle branch of Mahayana, is actually going to practice at all. So they're going to be very sympathetic and kind, and some of their philosophical statements might be that, well, hey, we're all part of the ever-changing universe, and in all reality, I'm not really any different from you, or you're not all that different from me, or anything else. One of the phrases that they may say is, may all creatures be well and happy. Now, the bodhisattva is the person who has been enlightened. It's the holy person who can help to teach others. And really one of their vows is to be constantly reborn until all are enlightened, and then they can leave the earth. All right, the third and final type of branch, of Buddhism that I want to mention today was the Vajrayana. And with that branch, what we see again is a little bit different viewpoint of what is really focused on.